My name is Harold Emerson. I'm 81 years old, and for the past 5 years, I've lived in the house I built with my own hands nearly half a century ago, just outside of Roanoke, Virginia. The bricks in the fireplace still hold the warmth of the first fire I lit there, back when my wife, Lorraine, and I first moved in. It was a modest place even then, but Lorraine had a way of making it feel grand. She was one of those women who could turn 4 walls and a lamp into a home. When she passed, the air in the house changed. It was like something vital had been pulled out of the very wood, something I couldn't fix with a screwdriver or glue. Her scent still lingers in the linen closet, lavender and lemon soap, and sometimes I go in there just to breathe it in, to remember what it felt like to be needed, to be part of something warm. After Lorraine's stroke, everything became quieter, colder, and more difficult to explain to people who thought grief came in sharp bursts. It doesn't. Not always. Sometimes it creeps, it lingers, it softens your spine until you're bent without realizing it. The house became my world, the living room, my country. I learned to cook for one, badly at first, though I got better. I took to feeding the birds outside just so I'd hear chirping again. I tried joining a community group for seniors, but it was mostly cheerful people talking about cruises, and I didn't have the stomach for manufactured joy. So I stopped going. Instead, I focused on the small routines. Oatmeal in the morning, the radio playing old jazz standards in the afternoon, and a crossword puzzle every evening with a lukewarm cup of tea. My son Russell started visiting more often around that time. At first, I was grateful. He said he was checking in, making sure I wasn't turning into a hermit, as he put it, but he always seemed in a rush, like his mind was elsewhere. He would walk from room to room slowly, hands in pockets, noting cracks in the walls or faded carpets like he was preparing a report. He'd say things like, this place could use some updating, or, have you thought about maybe downsizing, Dad? At first, I laughed it off. The house was mine. Downsizing felt like surrendering. But over time, his tone changed. Less joking, more strategic. Russell's wife, Marlene, was a different story altogether. She hadn't cared much for Lorraine. She never said it outright, but you could see it in her eyes, and she didn't care much for me either. She always spoke to me like I was a patient in a hospital she didn't want to be assigned. Her visits were always short, tight-lipped affairs. I thought maybe that would change when they moved in with me, but it only got worse. They said it was temporary, said they'd sold their condo to free up some equity and were looking for a new place nearby. Said they wanted to be close so they could help out, so I wouldn't have to manage everything on my own. I told myself it was a good idea. I'd have company. I'd see my 2 grandkids more often. The house would finally be alive again, but I was wrong. Marlene took over the kitchen within the first week, said it was more efficient if she did the cooking. She rearranged the pantry, threw out my spices, and told me salt was off limits. At my age, suddenly I needed permission to use my own microwave. She began speaking in passive-aggressive tones about clutter, about old man smells, about safety hazards like the rug in the hallway that had been there since 1986. One afternoon, I found her going through my filing cabinet. She said she was just organizing, but she had a highlighter in her hand and a look on her face like a banker appraising a failing asset. Russell didn't stop her. If anything, he seemed to defer to her more now, like she'd become the household general, and he was just her uniformed subordinate. He worked long hours, and when he was home, he was glued to his laptop or phone. The few times I tried to talk to him about Lorraine, he changed the subject. "Let's focus on the present, Dad," he'd say, or, "You're dwelling too much." He wasn't cruel, not in the way people usually mean it, but he was distant, cold in the way a closed door is cold. And I missed him. I missed the boy who used to sit on the porch with me during thunderstorms, watching lightning fork across the sky and asking me if thunder was God yelling. The grandchildren, Alex and Lacey, were polite, distant, teenagers with earbuds constantly plugged into their heads, whispering memes and trends I didn't understand. Lacey, the younger of the two, sometimes smiled at me across the table. Alex barely spoke. I tried to strike up conversations, asked about school, about their friends, about what they were reading. It was like shouting across a canyon. I became background noise to them, like the hum of a refrigerator, always there, never noticed. Once, when I walked into the kitchen, I heard Alex say to Lacey, "Why does he always just stand there like a ghost?" And they both laughed. That laugh stuck with me for days. Still, I convinced myself it was a phase. They were helping in their way. I told myself not to be sensitive. I was old after all. Maybe they really were worried about my health. Maybe I did need someone to manage my medications, to check the smoke alarms. But deep down, I knew the difference between care and control. And what I felt around Marlene wasn't care. It was containment. Everything shifted when Lorraine died, and it shifted again when they moved in. And the third shift, the one I never saw coming, was about to arrive. I didn't know it then, not fully. I sensed it like a coming storm you feel in your bones before you see the clouds. There were signs, whispers in the hallway, sudden silences when I entered a room, the sharpness in Marlene's voice when I asked if I could have eggs instead of oatmeal for breakfast. I started to feel like a boarder in my own house, a tenant living on borrowed time. Marlene put locks on the upstairs bathroom, said it was to keep the kids safe, but I wasn't born yesterday. The backyard shed where I kept my gardening tools was suddenly off limits. They changed the Wi-Fi password, said it was for security reasons. I stopped asking questions. I started writing things down, every strange comment, every suspicious change. I didn't know what I was preparing for, but I knew I had to be ready. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evening, watching the sun dip below the ridge, thinking about Lorraine, about the sound of her slippers in the hallway, the way she'd hum old songs while folding laundry. I'd wonder what she would say if she saw what our son had become, what he'd allowed. Would she have been stronger than me? Would she have stood up to them sooner? Or would they have broken her down too, with that slow drip of disrespect dressed up as concern? There was a heaviness in the air those days, not just from age or grief or arthritis. It was something else, an anticipation, a tightening of the screws. I didn't know what form it would take, how it would manifest. I only knew that something inside this house, my house, was about to change forever. and I wasn't sure I'd survive it. It began on a Monday. Russell had packed a duffel bag the night before, moving quietly through the hallway as if afraid to wake the dead. I watched him from my recliner, pretending to doze off with the television flickering some old detective show, though I hadn't been truly asleep in weeks. He had that look in his eye again, the one he wore when he was about to do something unpleasant and didn't want to explain it. Marlene didn't speak to me during breakfast the next morning. She handed me a plate with plain oatmeal, no sugar, no milk, not even a piece of toast on the side, and walked out of the kitchen as though I'd insulted her by existing. I ate it in silence, even though it tasted like damp cardboard, and washed it down with lukewarm tap water because the coffee maker had vanished from the counter. Just gone. No explanation. I thought maybe it was being cleaned or replaced, but deep down, I already knew better. Russell came into the kitchen, all business, wearing his navy blue windbreaker and that tight smile he put on whenever he didn't want to talk. He kissed Marlene on the cheek, ruffled Alex's hair, and gave Lacey a side hug before turning to me. "Dad, I'll be gone about a week. That conference in Charlotte finally came through. I've got panels, meetings, networking stuff. It's important for the company." I nodded slowly, sipping my water, trying not to show how much the sudden silence between us had grown into something permanent. "You'll be fine with Marlene and the kids," he added like it was a fact, like I didn't have a choice in the matter. "She's got everything covered." Then he was gone, door shutting behind him with a soft finality that somehow echoed through the walls. That was the beginning of the week that nearly broke me. Marlene waited until the afternoon to make her declaration. I had been reading on the porch, enjoying the rare spring warmth on my face, when she appeared in the doorway, arms folded, that familiar tightness in her jaw that preceded every change she imposed on the house. "We're starting a new routine," she said, without preamble, "for discipline, for clarity, for your health." I looked up from my book. Not understanding, she stepped closer, holding something behind her back. It was the padlock from the shed, now affixed to a chain around the refrigerator doors. "Starting today, I control the meals. No more wandering into the kitchen and snacking whenever you want. It's not good for you." "We're simplifying your diet." I stared at the refrigerator, then back at her, trying to laugh it off as a bad joke. But she didn't laugh. Her eyes were flat, unmoved, like a nurse following a protocol she didn't write. "I'll bring you your meals," she continued. "You'll have 1 plate a day, nutritionally balanced, modest portions. It's called intermittent fasting, very good for the elderly, clears the mind, sharpens the body, and no more coffee. You've had enough stimulants in your life." I wanted to say something, to protest, to tell her that I was a grown man, not a toddler or a lab animal. But I could feel my throat close up. Not with fear exactly, but with shame. The kind of shame you feel when you realize your dignity is no longer assumed, when someone you once considered family looks at you and sees a project, a burden, a misfiring machine. The first day, the hunger was manageable. She brought me a plate at 4 p.m. A hard-boiled egg, a scoop of cottage cheese, and a few baby carrots. She watched me eat it as if waiting for me to protest, but I didn't. I forced the food down and said thank you, hoping she'd feel some flicker of guilt. But she only nodded and took the plate without a word. I wasn't given breakfast the next morning. When I asked about it, she said, "You're on a schedule now, Harold. One meal, you'll adjust." I waited for lunch. It never came. Dinner was a bowl of plain broth and 3 saltines. That night, my stomach growled so loudly, it woke me up. I shuffled into the kitchen in the dark, heart pounding, only to find the padlock still in place. I stood there, hand on the cold chain, feeling something in me crack, not a loud break, but a hairline fracture in the structure of who I thought I was. By the 3rd day, the headaches began. I felt lightheaded every time I stood up. My hands trembled when I tried to button my shirt. I dropped a cup and it shattered. The sound sharp and almost welcome. A break that was visible, explainable. Marlene scolded me like a child. "This is why you shouldn't be in the kitchen. You're going to hurt yourself." "I'm just trying to help you." I muttered an apology, not because I believed I'd done anything wrong, but because my energy for confrontation had been eaten alive by the growling emptiness in my belly. That night, I passed out in the bathroom. One moment I was brushing my teeth without toothpaste, because apparently fluoride was too harsh for my gums, and the next, I was on the tile floor, my hip aching, my breath shallow. I must have made a sound because I heard footsteps pounding down the hallway. The door flew open. Lacey stood in the doorway, eyes wide, calling for her mother. Marlene arrived seconds later, took one look at me, and said, "He's fine. Probably slipped. Help him up, Lacey." No ambulance, no check for injuries, just 2 sets of hands pulling me back to my feet like I was a broken lamp they couldn't be bothered to replace. Later that night, I heard them arguing in the kitchen. Lacey's voice was urgent. "Mom, we should take him to the hospital. He fell. What if he's hurt?" Marlene snapped back, "Don't be dramatic. Your grandfather does this all the time. He's fine. If we go to the hospital, they'll ask questions. Do you want them thinking we can't take care of him?" I leaned against the wall in the hallway, listening, burning, not just from the hunger or the bruise on my hip, but from the realization that I was no longer seen as a person. I was a liability, a risk, a narrative they had to control. The next morning, there was no breakfast again. Only a note taped to my door. "Please stay in your room today. We're having people over. It's better if you rest." That afternoon, I smelled hot food, roast chicken, potatoes, something with herbs. I followed the scent to the top of the stairs and watched from the shadows as Marlene served heaping plates to her friends while I sat upstairs like a ghost, uninvited, unfed, and forgotten. It was that moment, watching my own kitchen, my own table, my own dishes being used to feed strangers while I starved upstairs, that I understood. This wasn't about health. It wasn't even about control anymore. It was punishment. It was eviction in slow motion. They were starving me. Not just of food, but of dignity, of presence, of voice. And for the first time in my life, I felt a cold, precise kind of anger. Not the kind that boils over and shouts, the kind that plans. Because if they thought starving me was discipline, then they hadn't yet learned what a man starved of love, respect, and legacy was capable of. On the 4th day, the silence became unbearable. It wasn't the kind of silence that came with peace or rest, but a strategic, weaponized silence, one that buzzed behind walls and crept under doors, built not from absence, but from deliberate exclusion. I had become invisible in my own home, an object that required management rather than engagement. I noticed the pattern forming with increasing clarity. I was to be confined, controlled, and eventually erased. That morning, Marlene didn't bring me a meal until after 5 o'clock, and when she did, it was a single boiled potato on a plate, unpeeled, unsalted, presented like an offering to a stray dog. She didn't speak as she set it down, only gave me a long look that I couldn't quite name, part annoyance, part triumph. I waited until she left the room before touching it. Not because I hoped it would taste better cold, but because I needed the illusion of choice in a life that had been stripped of all agency. When I tried to speak with Alex later that evening, he pulled off his headphones and looked at me like I had malfunctioned. I asked him how school was going, whether he still liked chemistry, whether he had any thoughts on college yet. He said, "Mom said you shouldn't bother us when we're studying," then turned his music back on. I stood there a few seconds longer, watching him not watch me, then returned to my room, where the air smelled stale and the windows no longer opened properly. That night, I dreamed that Lorraine came to me wearing the cardigan she used to wear on cold mornings. She was standing in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal and humming something soft. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but she turned and said, "They've locked you in, Harold. You need to find the door." I woke up gasping, my mouth dry, my limbs heavy, and for a moment, I didn't remember where I was. The next day, I began my inventory. I didn't have the strength to fight them directly, not yet, but I needed to understand the battlefield. I noted how many locks had been added to the cabinets. I checked the medicine drawer in the upstairs bathroom and found that half my prescriptions were missing. Marlene claimed they were refilled, but the bottles were gone, and the pharmacy app I'd secretly installed on my old tablet showed no recent activity. She had either hidden them or stopped ordering them altogether. My heart medication, in particular, had been replaced with a cheap, over-the-counter bottle labeled Heart Health Support Herbal Formula. I stared at the label for a long time, my fingers trembling. I wasn't just being starved, I was being slowly dismantled. On the 6th day, I collapsed again, this time in the hallway. My legs gave out without warning, and I crumpled near the staircase, too weak to call for help. Lacey found me after an hour, maybe more. I couldn't be sure. Time had started to blur. She knelt beside me, panic in her voice, asking what happened. I tried to speak, but my lips wouldn't obey. She pulled out her phone to call for help, but before she could, Marlene appeared at the top of the stairs, her voice sharp and clipped. "Put the phone away. He's fine. Just low blood sugar. He needs rest, not the emergency room." Lacey hesitated, but eventually obeyed, helping me to my feet and guiding me back to my room. Marlene followed us, arms crossed, then stood in the doorway like a guard. "You scared her," she said to me. "Stop pretending to be sicker than you are. It's manipulative." I wanted to scream at her, to tell her that the pain in my joints, the dizziness, the emptiness in my stomach weren't theatrics, but my body unraveling, thread by thread. Instead, I said nothing. I lay back on my bed and closed my eyes, because speaking required energy I didn't have. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I prayed. Not because I believed it would change anything, not because I thought God would reach down and pluck me out of this hell, but because I needed to hear myself ask for something. I needed to remember the sound of my own hope. I asked Lorraine to help me. I asked her to remind me who I used to be before I became a ghost. I asked her to give me the strength to survive one more day. On the seventh morning, the hunger pains had dulled into something constant, less of a scream and more of a whisper that never ceased. I had stopped expecting breakfast. The only sound was the distant hum of the dishwasher and Marlene's voice drifting through the vents as she laughed on the phone with someone, her sister maybe, or one of her church friends. She was talking about estate planning, and I caught phrases like, "He's still technically the owner, but that won't be for long, and once the guardianship papers are in place, we'll have more control." I sat up slowly, the room spinning. The voice in my head no longer trembling, but sharpening into a shape I recognized. Rage. Cold, clear, controlled rage. She was planning to take legal control of my life. Not just the house or my finances, but my personhood. She wanted the court to declare me unfit, to remove my rights, to make me a ward of the very people who were starving me into silence. I realized then that I had allowed this to happen, not because I was weak, but because I had believed deeply, foolishly, in the power of family. I had believed that being a father meant something sacred, something permanent. But now I saw it for what it was, a title, not a guarantee. They no longer saw me as family. They saw me as an obstacle. That afternoon, I made my first move. When Marlene went out to get groceries, taking the keys and locking the fridge behind her, I searched her office. I had to move quickly, quietly, with the precision of a man who had spent his life balancing numbers and anticipating shortfalls. In her desk drawer, beneath a stack of unopened mail and church newsletters, I found a folder labeled Guardianship Materials. Inside were forms partially filled out listing me as mentally declining, paranoid, and inconsistent in self-care. There were statements, supposedly written by Russell, saying I had forgotten his birthday, that I had wandered out of the house at night, that I had once tried to drink bleach, thinking it was water. All of it was lies, elaborate, disgusting lies designed to make me look like a danger to myself. I stared at the pages, bile rising in my throat. My own son had signed them. My son, who I had taught to ride a bike, who I had held through childhood fevers, who I had hugged after his first divorce. He had signed them. I took photos of every page with my tablet, uploaded them to a private cloud account I had quietly created weeks ago when the first suspicions took root. I didn't know what I would do with them yet, but I knew I would need evidence. I knew this wouldn't end with a confrontation in the kitchen or a speech over dinner. This was war, and wars are not won with honesty alone. When Marlene returned, she brought me a bowl of plain rice and half an apple. She smiled as she set it down. "You're looking thinner already. This is good. Your heart will thank you." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a woman who married my son. I saw a woman who had studied me like a problem to be solved, who had decided that starvation was a form of compassion. I ate the food slowly, methodically, not because I was grateful, but because I needed the strength. I needed my mind sharp and my body functional for what was coming next. That night I didn't dream. I lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house I had built, the house that had become a prison, the house that bore witness to my humiliation. I thought about Lorraine's cardigan folded in the bottom drawer and wondered what she would do. Then I thought about Russell's signature on those papers, about the lies etched in ink, and I knew exactly what I had to do. They had taken my food. They had taken my medicine. They had tried to take my name, but they hadn't taken my mind. And that was their fatal mistake. The turning point arrived not with a bang, but with an email. I had been careful, using the old laptop Lorraine and I once shared, hidden behind a loose panel in the hall closet, where Marlene never bothered to clean. It was slow to start. The screen flickered with age, and some of the keys stuck. But it worked well enough for what I needed. I'd already uploaded the guardianship forms and photos of the forged signatures to a secure cloud drive, and I had begun drafting a letter, a kind of testimonial about everything that had taken place. It was neither a plea for help nor a cry for attention. It was documentation, something that could speak for me if or when they silenced me completely. But on that particular morning, I opened the laptop to check my email and found something unexpected. A message from an old friend, Martin Dreyfus, my former neighbor, who had moved to Charleston years ago after his wife died. The subject line read, "Saw your son last week. You okay?" I stared at the message. My breath caught somewhere between my lungs and my throat. I hadn't told anyone what was happening, not out of pride, not even really out of fear, but because I didn't believe anyone would believe me. I was the aging father, the man who had already stepped 1 foot out of relevance. But here it was, unsolicited, uninvited, someone reaching in from the outside. I opened the email. Martin wrote that he had run into Russell at a business event in Charlotte, and that Russell had mentioned I was no longer really myself, that I was confused most days, that Marlene was handling everything now. Martin said it hadn't sat right with him. He remembered me as sharp, meticulous, proud. He asked if I needed anything, even if it was just someone to talk to. I sat back from the laptop, the screen glowing in the half-darkness of my room, and I felt the first real shift in my chest. Not hope, not quite, but confirmation. It wasn't just happening in my head. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. Russell had already started laying the groundwork for my legal disappearance. This email, this small, fragile lifeline, meant that someone else saw it too. I replied quickly, simply, "I need help. Can't talk. But yes, something's wrong. Please call me tomorrow. Noon." I included the old landline number in my room, the one Marlene didn't know still worked. I had fixed it up myself weeks earlier, using a spare cable I found in the attic. I wasn't ready to tell Martin everything yet, but if there was a way out of this, it would begin with that call. That night, I prepared. I cleaned myself up as best I could, shaved with a dull razor, and put on a clean shirt that still smelled faintly of Lorraine's lavender drawer sachets. I needed to sound like myself when Martin called, and I needed him to hear a man. Not a case file, not a ghost, not the shell of someone they could easily label incompetent. The next morning, I waited by the phone like a teenager waiting for news from a crush. At 12:03, it rang. Martin's voice hadn't changed, still deep and steady, with that slight southern drawl that always made him sound like he was reciting a novel. "Harold," he said, "talk to me." And so I did. I told him everything, slowly, deliberately, fact by fact, name by name. I didn't embellish. I didn't cry. I told him about the padlock on the fridge, about the withheld medication, about the falsified documents, about collapsing in the hallway and being denied medical attention. I told him about Russell's signature, about Marlene's smug declarations, about how I was being erased from my own life, not with violence, but with the practiced precision of two people who thought no one would believe an old man over a married couple with a mortgage and two well-dressed kids. When I finished, there was silence on the line. For a long moment, I thought the call had dropped. But then Martin spoke, and there was steel in his voice. "Harold, listen to me. This ends now. I'm coming up. I know a lawyer in Richmond who specializes in elder law. I'll bring him with me. Sit tight. We'll get you out." The call ended, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was drowning. But it was also the most dangerous moment, because if Marlene or Russell sensed that I had reached outside the walls of their little system, they might accelerate whatever they were planning. So, I had to keep acting weak. I had to keep letting them believe I was defeated. I ate the tiny portions Marlene gave me without complaint. I let her believe her psychological chokehold still worked. When she looked smug, I looked small. When she snapped, I flinched. But inside, I was coiled like a spring, a man waiting for the right day. 2 days later, Martin arrived in a beige sedan with Virginia plates. I watched from the upstairs window, hidden behind the curtains, as he got out, straightened his coat, and walked up the driveway like he still lived in the neighborhood. With him was a tall, gray-haired man in a tailored blazer. The doorbell rang. I heard Marlene answer, heard her voice rise, brittle and irritated. "No, Harold is resting. No, we didn't invite anyone." And then the lawyer's voice, calm and professional, said, "Ma'am, I'm here on behalf of Mr. Emerson. He has requested a welfare check and legal consultation. You may refuse to cooperate, but we are within our rights to request access." Marlene called for Russell, who had returned the night before, their voices tangled in a muffled argument. I heard footsteps storm up the stairs, and suddenly my door opened. Russell stood there, red-faced. "What the hell did you do?" I didn't answer. I looked at him the way you look at a stranger in the street who says your name and you don't know how. "Dad, you're confused," he said. And for the first time, I saw fear behind the anger. Not concern, fear. Because I was no longer playing the part. Because I had stepped out of the cage. I stood up. My legs shook a little, but I stayed upright. "I'm not confused," I said quietly. "I'm starving. I'm sick. And I'm done pretending you didn't do this." I pushed past him, slow but steady, and walked down the stairs, one step at a time. Martin was waiting at the bottom, his eyes wide, his hands out, like he was catching a falling comrade. The lawyer turned when he saw me and said, "Mr. Emerson, are you prepared to speak on record?" I nodded. "Yes," I said. "I have things to say," and I did. The descent into darkness that began with withheld meals and missing medicine deepened into a deliberate campaign of erasure. And as the days slipped into one another, I felt myself becoming not just forgotten, but actively erased. And it was on that cruel dawn of the 9th morning that Marlene introduced what she called a more structured routine, though there was nothing soothing or kind about her order. She locked away my cane, saying I didn't need it because balance comes with time, though. I had used it for decades after my hip injury, and with the cane gone, I stumbled through the hallway and thought for a moment that perhaps I had become invisible in my own home, breathing thin air in a house built by my own hands, where each coated floorboard echoed the betrayal that was settling into my bones like a cold, silent infection. And the look in Marlene's eyes when she watched me fall was not one of concern, but of detached amusement, as though she were sitting ringside at a boxing match I didn't agree to fight. And when Lacey gasped and extended her hand, Marlene snapped at her to pull him up quickly that we don't need drama. And as I lay curled in a heap, the world shifted. Everything tilted, and I realized this was not incompetence, it was intent. I dragged myself to my feet that afternoon and used the last of my energy to piece together what had changed in the house. The pantry locks multiplied, one on the cans, another on the drawer with sugar, and a third on the shelf with crackers that used to be my small comfort. Medications continued to vanish, and when I asked Marlene about them, she told me they were being consolidated, that less is more, and that even if I felt faint or dizzy, it was natural for my age, nothing to worry about. The humiliation was absolute, an old man treated like a failing engine to be decommissioned. But internally, I was ignited, and I clung to that spark, refusing to burn out. The elders in my small community had taught me that pride was not about stubbornness. It was about protecting what you built. And this house, this life, was mine. One evening, after Marlene left for an evening out with her church friends, I suppose to show how capable she was, I realized just how much I was trapped. I paced my bedroom, mind whirring, and recognized the bars of my confinement. Not physical, but psychological, made of subtle dismissals, withheld food, and lies signed in my name. I thought of the walls, the muted wallpaper, the smell of mildew mixed with detergent, familiar, yet polluted with an undercurrent of menace. And then I heard a knock, soft, cautious, but enough to make my pulse race. It was Lacey. She peeked in and whispered, "Grandpa, I left something for you in the shed." I blinked. "Are you sure?" She nodded, eyes glistening. "It's just so you don't feel so alone." In the shed, I discovered a half-used jar of peanut butter and a stale but still edible granola bar wrapped in a napkin. My hands shook as I took the food, but hunger was not all I felt. There was something else, recognition that not everyone had forgotten me, that there were flickers of loyalty still breathing in my life. I held a jar to my chest, tasting salty crumbs, and understood that the real war wasn't just for my survival, but for the soul of the family and the home I created. Lacey's small gesture was a rope thrown into the void. The next day, when Marlene found the jar missing, she screeched at me that I was being childish, that this was not a pantry, and I needed to learn boundaries. And I said nothing, because boundaries already meant nothing here. But inside I pledged to fight, not with anger, but with clarity. I developed a plan to document every moment, the swallowed meals, the forbidden food access, the collapsed afternoons, the evidence of guardianship forms, the forged signatures, and now the small rebellions of kindness from my grandson. All of it needed telling. So I spent hours writing it down, compressing grief and outrage into words that could stand for me when I no longer could. 2 days later, the tipping point arrived. I was in the living room, my body fragile, withered by hunger and neglect, when Marlene walked in with a bill from an attorney on the table, my attorney supposedly stating that a conservatorship hearing had been scheduled for 3 weeks later, that I was being deemed mentally incompetent, and that the house would be transferred into guardianship if I didn't appear, though it was clear I couldn't appear because I was barely upright. Her voice was cool as she addressed me. "This is for your good, Dad. You understand, don't you? We'll take care of everything." In that moment, something snapped, not in panic, but in icy resolve, like a blade pulled from its sheath. I looked at the paper, the heading, their names printed on it, and I knew I had to act before I was legally erased. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my phone, the one they thought broken, and I called the lawyer Martin had arranged, whispering that if they filed those papers, I had proof of fraud, of coercion, of medical neglect. I told him Marlene was planning to switch off my oxygen if I didn't stay compliant, and that Russell had signed documents he couldn't possibly have believed. I told him I was ready to testify despite the exhaustion, despite the hunger, because there was nothing more to lose than the rest of me. The lawyer's voice on the other end was calm but electrified. He would intervene, he promised. He would submit an injunction and request an emergency hearing. Marlene stood at the doorway, watching me phone in my confession, and fear flickered in her eyes. Fear of exposure, fear of consequence. The dynamic shifted in that instant. The predator had glimpsed vulnerability, but the prey had revealed the net. I sank to the couch, trembling, but inside I felt solid. For the first time in days, I wasn't fading. That night I ate. Not a meal from Marlene, but the peanut butter and granola bar smuggled by Lacey. I savored every bite, every salty hint, every stubborn, defiant crumb. And as I lay there afterward, with the taste still on my tongue, I realized the second escalation had broken their narrative. They had turned the house into a prison disguised as discipline, but now, with witnesses, documents, and small acts of love, the truth was slipping free. The next morning the phone rang with the voice of the lawyer and of Martin behind him. "We're filing today. Expect them to push back, but we will fight," I answered with a voice older than my years, full of starvation, but stronger than their cold, calculated strategy. I would survive this assault, not by withstanding it, but by dismantling its foundation with truth, clarity, and the knowledge that love, even smuggled in a peanut butter jar, carries more power than fear. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning, and though I had barely the strength to walk on my own, I insisted on attending in person, not because I trusted the legal system more than written testimony, but because I needed them to see me, not a report, not an affidavit, but the man they had tried to erase, the man they said was no longer capable of coherent thought, the man they starved like an unwanted pet and pushed into the margins of his own life. Martin picked me up in the early hours, helping me into his sedan with quiet dignity, saying nothing as I settled into the passenger seat, wearing a suit that hung looser than it used to, but still carried the scent of lavender from Lorraine's cedar chest. The drive to the courthouse was long and quiet, lined with brittle trees that seemed to mirror my bones, but my mind was sharp, burning with a clarity that only desperation can give. And as the town passed by in blurs of gray and pale green, I rehearsed what I would say. Not as a victim, not as a spectacle, but as a man reclaiming what had been taken from him. Inside the courtroom, the air was cool and dry, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above as I was helped into my seat beside the attorney Martin had arranged for me, a woman named Colleen with silver hair and an expression that could break glass. Across the aisle, Marlene sat upright and immaculate, in a gray blouse and pearl earrings, her lips pursed in something between irritation and false concern, while Russell sat beside her, looking as if he wanted to be anywhere else, his fingers tapping out an invisible rhythm on the table, eyes darting everywhere except toward me. They looked to the outside eye like a responsible couple, put together, organized, compassionate, and that was their weapon, the disguise of normalcy, of civic participation, of plausible care. But I had documents. I had time-stamped records. I had photos. I had my voice, and I was going to use every last ounce of it before the day was done. The judge was a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a precise manner, and when the proceedings began, she spoke directly, asking if the petitioners were prepared to state their case. Marlene's lawyer stood first, launching into a speech about decline, about signs of early dementia, about episodes of confusion and erratic behavior. He referenced supposed incidents, imagined fires, missing items, irrational fears that had no grounding in reality but sounded plausible enough on paper. He painted me as unstable, as fragile, as unfit. And then, when he sat down, Colleen stood, and everything changed. With each sentence, Colleen dismantled their argument, calmly laying out the inconsistencies, presenting the guardianship forms I had found, the discrepancies in medication records, the digital timestamps, proving I had been lucid and active at times. They claimed I was lost in confusion. She submitted the email from Martin, the sworn statement from the pharmacist, noting the sudden halt in prescription pickups, the photo of the padlocked fridge, the recorded phone call where Marlene discussed simplifying my food needs like I was a lab animal. The judge read through the materials slowly, carefully, her brow furrowed deeper with each page. Then it was my turn. They asked me if I wanted to make a statement, and I stood, not because I needed to, but because I wanted them to see the effort, to understand the cost of every word. I told them about Lorraine and the home we built, about the years I spent tending that house, raising our son, hoping for a peaceful, final chapter. I told them how Russell stopped visiting after her death, how Marlene moved in under the guise of help, how the refrigerator became forbidden, how meals became tools of control. I told him about falling on the floor and being left there, about having my medication replaced with herbal nonsense, about the coldness in their voices when they spoke about me like I was a broken machine. And I ended by saying this: I may be old, but I am not gone, and I am not mad. What they wanted was not to help me. What they wanted was to own me, to profit from me, and to silence me. But I will not be silenced. When I sat down, the courtroom was very still. The judge turned to Marlene and asked flatly why there were no medical evaluations from actual doctors, only handwritten notes. Marlene began to protest, saying I was manipulative, that I was turning people against her. "He lies," she hissed. "He's always been dramatic. Ask Russell." And when the judge turned to my son, he froze. He looked down at his hands and said nothing. Silence. Not support, not defense. Just nothing. And in that silence, the truth spoke louder than any testimony. The judge recessed for an hour to review the materials. When she returned, she declared me mentally competent and terminated the guardianship petition with prejudice, meaning they could not refile without substantial new evidence. She advised me to seek a restraining order if I felt unsafe. She said, and I quote, "This is not a case of dementia. This is a case of manipulation." And with that, the gavel fell. Outside the courthouse, the air felt lighter. Martin clapped my shoulder, and Colleen said I had done well. But I wasn't thinking about victory. I was thinking about what came next. The war wasn't over, but the power was mine again. I was no longer the one being observed. I was the one moving. After the hearing, I didn't go home, not right away. I stayed a few nights at a small guest house Martin arranged for me, tucked behind an old bed and breakfast near the Blue Ridge foothills. It had no television, just a ticking clock on the wall and a narrow window that looked out on a maple tree beginning to turn with the early signs of autumn. The quiet there wasn't like the suffocating silence of my house, where I had been ignored into near invisibility. It was gentle, honest, and I could breathe. I spent the first evening sitting in the worn armchair beside the window, holding a cup of broth the innkeeper brought me, watching shadows stretch along the floor like the hands of someone who didn't want to leave just yet. I was not yet healed, but I was no longer captive. My ribs still showed beneath my shirt, my joints still trembled when I stood, and the phantom ache of hunger still lingered like a bruise under my skin, but I knew that in time it would fade. What mattered now was what I would do with the days ahead. Russell called twice. In the following week, I didn't answer the first time. The second time, I picked up, but said nothing. He started with an apology, or at least something shaped like one. "Dad, I didn't know what she was doing. I wasn't paying attention. I was distracted. I'm sorry. I let things get out of hand." His voice was dry, defensive, even in its contrition. He said he wanted to fix things, to talk, to explain. I told him that forgiveness is not the same thing as return. I told him that a house can be rebuilt, but trust isn't made of wood and nails. It's made of presence, of attention, and he hadn't been present for years. He said nothing after that. The line went quiet, and I hung up, not with anger, but with a calm resignation. He had made his choices. and now I would make mine. I filed for a restraining order against Marlene and had the locks on the house changed. Russell was not named, but I made it clear he would not be welcome unless I invited him. With Colleen's help, I rewrote my will, not out of spite, but from clarity. The house would go to a foundation for abused elders. The rest of my assets would be split between Lacey and a local organization that provides shelter for seniors at risk. I wrote a letter to Lacey, not to guilt her, not to instruct her, but to thank her. I told her that one granola bar and one whispered kindness had saved my life more than she could understand, and that no matter what her parents told her, she should always trust the part of herself that had known something was wrong. In the months that followed, I sold the house. It was not an easy choice, but it was the necessary one. Too many shadows lingered in the corners. Too many memories had been twisted by betrayal. I moved to a quiet apartment near a lake, where I planted flowers in pots and fed the ducks each morning. I began keeping a journal, not of what had been done to me, but of what I still loved. The taste of ripe peaches, the sound of Glenn Miller on an old radio, the way sunlight hit the water at 4:37 in the afternoon. I had almost lost those things, and I would not take them for granted again. Sometimes people ask me how I survived, how I endured a week of starvation, months of humiliation, the slow death of my dignity. And I tell them it wasn't strength, not in the way they think. It was memory. It was knowing who I had been before they tried to define who I was allowed to be. I held on to the echo of Lorraine's voice, to the creak of our floorboards, to the weight of my own name said with respect. That's what saved me. Not fury, not revenge. Just a simple truth that I remembered myself when they tried to make me forget. I don't hear from Russell anymore, not often. A card came once, Father's Day, I think, with a generic message inside. I left it unopened. It's not hate I feel. It's distance. A great, quiet ocean between what I had hoped he'd become and what he allowed himself to be. But I still believe people can change. Not for me, perhaps, but for themselves. And maybe one day he will. As for Marlene, I no longer say her name. Some things don't need to be remembered. They just need to be released. And as for me, I eat when I'm hungry. I speak when I choose. I walk freely through my own door. And every morning, before the sun rises, I sit with a hot cup of coffee and say to the silence, I am still here.